Hello everyone, I'm Eternal Flame here, and today I'm here to talk about what has been revealed in the most recent chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen, which is the entire reveal that Yuta Okkotsu, via using Kenjaku's curse technique, has taken Gojo's body, and more importantly, why I think Yuta Okkotsu in Gojo's body is not going to be enough and will ultimately fail in taking down Sukuna. And the main reason why I believe he is destined to fail in taking down Sukuna, at least in Gojo's body, if he tries to fight Sukuna alone, is mainly because of the fact that I don't think Yuta can utilize Gojo's body to its fullest, and I think if anything he's actually going to be weaker in Gojo's body than Gojo himself would be. So I'm going to explain in this video why he is ultimately destined to fail against Sukuna. Now this all goes back to one question, which is probably by far and away the most iconic quote in all of JJK other than the entire I am the honored one thing, but that's also not a JJK quote. Anyways, the quote I'm talking about is what Geto had asked to Gojo so long ago. Are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest? And the way I interpret it, as well as a lot of other people interpret it, is basically Geto asking, does your identity lie in the fact that you are the strongest? Are you who you are because you are the strongest? Or are you the strongest because of who you are? Are you the reason why you are the strongest? Or to put it into more simpler terms, is Gojo Satoru who he is because of his powers, or is his powers so good because of the fact that he is Gojo Satoru himself? And a lot of people actually believe that Suguru Geto's question remains unanswered even now, that this is what the entire point of this fight is going to be, answering that question, but in my opinion the answer to that question has already been revealed for a long time. It's just people haven't looked too deep in, and this is only going to solidify what the actual answer is. Which, in my opinion, the reason why Gojo is the strongest of the modern era is not because he has an extremely good curse technique, it's not because he has good powers, but it's because Gojo is himself. It's because Gojo is creative enough and smart enough to know how to use it. Because even though Yuta Okkotsu does have access to all of Gojo's memories, because we know Kenjaku had access to all of Geto's memories, and while he has access to all the knowledge on how to use it, that's not going to change the fact that he is not Gojo. He doesn't fight in the same way that Gojo does. Even if he tries to fight as Gojo and tries to impersonate Gojo, he is not truly Gojo. The only one who can fight to the full potential of Gojo's body is Gojo Satoru himself. And that's what I think a lot of people's mistake is about this entire thing, and assuming why Yuta Okkotsu is going to do well. Because they assume just because he has access to Limitless plus 6 size that he's going to be on Gojo's level, but he will not be because he is not Gojo himself. So if he tries to fight as Gojo and impersonate Gojo, which is what I think he is trying to do this entire time, it will ultimately not work. Now, why do I think that Gojo has already answered that question? That's what I'm going to get into now. Mainly because, in my opinion, this is a really cool detail that a lot of people don't actually look at the Gojo versus Sukuna fight for enough, in my opinion, because a lot of people were kind of just focused on their agendas at the time when they were reading the fight, but when you reread the fight with this context in mind, it actually looks really impressive, and it's a really cool thing that Gege implemented into it, which is the fact that every time that Gojo gets an advantage in that fight and actually puts Sukuna on the ropes, it's not just because he has a strong technique, but it's because of the fact that Gojo thinks of his way out. It's because of the fact that Gojo is so quick to adapt and effectively change the tides of the battle, showing his battle intelligence, which is what really allows him to use the 6 size plus Limitless to such an amazing degree. And just to give some examples that Gojo's intelligence and battle IQ is what allows him to fight so well, I'm going to take you guys back to when Gojo and Sukuna were doing their entire domain expansion clashes. After all, what allowed Gojo to live for so long inside of the first domain other than his RCT skill? After all, that was an RCT skill that Gojo had developed himself. The entire RCT trick that Gojo made to keep the 6 size constantly active allowed his RCT to reach such an amazing speed that the only person who had faster RCT speed was Hikari Kinji himself and maybe Sukuna. It wasn't like his technique was so good that he was able to just push the domain away from him. No, he had to think of his way out. Speaking of that, it wasn't the fact that Gojo had such a strong technique and strong domain that allowed him to counter against Sukuna's domain. Even though Yuta does have access to that knowledge, it was Gojo's adaptability and creativity that allowed him to fight against Sukuna's domain to begin with. Which that combat adaptability and ingenuity allowed him to leave such a mark on Sukuna that it ended up affecting the entirety of the battle for a long while, forcing Sukuna's domain to be put on cooldown and forcing Sukuna to have to put binding vows on his domain. It was also Gojo who thought of the way and method on how to work around the domain expansion cooldown time from burnout, something that Yuta Okkotsu himself had thought of impossible. But the domain expansions weren't the only case of this happening, as one example of this is the entire red-black flash combo, which was Gojo taking advantage of the fact that Sukuna didn't actually fully know how red functioned and delayed the explosion. Another show of Gojo's battle intelligence allowing him to really push himself as the strongest. Even Unlimited Hollow was something that was never done in the past, and something that Gojo had created on the spot, which had left so much damage on Sukuna, it allowed them, as alongside Kashimo's assistance, to be able to force Sukuna to transform. It was Gojo who put Sukuna in such a state that he was forced to transform. It was through Gojo's battle intelligence that he forced Sukuna to include a binding vow on his technique. All of this is effectively just to prove the entire fact that it is Gojo himself who had made his technique the strongest, and while I do believe this answer was mainly coming from Sukuna versus Gojo, there are also little hints and sprinkles of this in the entirety of the manga when we see Gojo. For example, how Gojo was the one who invented the 0.2 second domain expansion, or how Gojo was the one who had invented the entire automatic RCT on the brain in order for him to constantly keep the 6 eyes active, something that no other 6 eyes user in history was capable of doing or had proven they were capable of doing. After all, it's always been a case in JJK that mentality is by far and away the most important thing. After all, look at Megumi Fushiguro himself. Megumi had a massive mental roadblock that he ended up getting over inside of the fight against the Finger Bearer, which allowed him to get much stronger and awaken his domain expansion. And also is very heavily shown how important mentality is, because it's Sukuna's mentality that allowed him to ascend Megumi's technique to truly look like a god tier technique, down to the point where most people who had thought that 10 Shadows was a bad technique actually looks really good because of the way Sukuna was using it, and a lot of people were on the entire 10 Shadows train. All of this just to come back to Gojo is to say, you can't just physically be the strongest. You can't just have a power that makes you physically the strongest, and even in this specific case, you can't just have the memories that make you the strongest. You need to have the mentality that is forged through battle, the ones that Gojo and Sukuna had ended up developing, in order to truly reach this level of the strongest. You need to have the proper mentality, and Yuta Okkotsu does not have the mentality because he is right now trying to imitate Gojo himself, which is also where I ultimately think he is going to fail, because he is trying to imitate Gojo, because he is trying to become the strongest by being Gojo, and that will simply not work. After all, funnily enough, we have actually gotten a very similar situation to this in the past with Toji Fushiguro himself, where whether you believe that Toji would have lost to Gojo or not is completely irrelevant, but what is important is the fact that Toji had ended up nerfing himself because he ended up fighting not for money but for his own pride, basically betraying who he was as a person, and that was ultimately one of the reasons why he ended up losing to Gojo Satoru in the way he did. And it's also the other reason why I believe that Yuta Okkotsu is going to lose right here and now, purely because of the fact that they only see the Limitless and 6 Eyes as a technique, purely because of the fact that they have a lack of understanding of who Gojo is, at least in my opinion. I believe that the way they currently see it as is that by taking the technique, they're just going to have a much better shot against him, which, while that is true, the Limitless is a very, very strong technique. After all, the ability to infinitely use red, infinitely use blue, as well as use purple is all very, very useful, but it's not in the hands of Gojo. It's not in the hands of the one who made the weapon. Now you have someone else who is using the weapon, and sure, yes, they have the memories on how to use the weapon. It doesn't make them ultimately that good at using the weapon. It doesn't ultimately make them reach their full pinnacle on using that weapon. Sure, Yuta Okkotsu now has the instruction manual as well as the body, but he doesn't have the experience necessary to truly use it at its pinnacle, and that is ultimately why I think Yuta Okkotsu is going to fail, because of the fact that Yuta is trying to become a second Gojo and abandoning who he is as a person. By trying to become a second Gojo, he is ultimately going to fail. This is very heavily shown that Yuta does want to become a second Gojo, purely because of the fact that he wanted to become the monster in case the burden was no longer on Gojo, and then put the burden on himself when Gojo passed, that he wanted to be the one up next, since no one else wanted to be. He was willing to become that thing, that monster. So even though he has the instructions, even though he has the path that has been laid out by Gojo, I think he is going to end up falling short simply because he is not Gojo. And in my opinion, this is also very dependent on two separate other things on whether he ends up failing or not. One of those things are the way he fights, mainly because of the fact that while I think Yuta is trying to impersonate Gojo, Yuta is trying to act as Gojo, I think Yuta Okkotsu is going to do better if he tries to fight as himself. If Yuta tries to use the Limitless in his own way, rather than trying to become a second Gojo, he should end up doing much better. However, I'm not entirely sure he's going to end up doing it, especially considering how he tends to use these types of techniques. For example, how he copied Finn Icebreaker and used it in a similar way to Uro. But at the same time, if he ends up utilizing the Limitless plus 6 size in his own specific type of way, I think he is going to end up doing much better, but I don't think he's going to be on par with Gojo, just much closer than I think he's going to be if he tries to impersonate Gojo like I'm expecting him to be. There is also the potential that he might also have access to his other copied curse techniques, but I'm not entirely 100% certain on it, but at the same time, we also know Kenjaku could still use his other curse techniques. Either way, I do think it's worth mentioning nonetheless. However, there is a second reason why I ultimately think he's going to fail, because this is going to be the way that I think his success can be spelled out, which this way is, if Yuta has taken on the role of the monster, can Yuta end up doing something that Gojo himself couldn't do? Can Yuta be able to have opponents fight alongside him, or is Yuta going to see himself as having to be a monster and embrace that burden alone? However, while I think the path to victory is ultimately going to be allowing the others to fight with him, basically making this a massive jumping, I don't actually think that Yuta is going to allow this to happen, mainly because of the way he worded becoming a monster, and the way he actually views Gojo. Because as much as Yuta views Gojo as a person, he also views Gojo as a monster, or at least the one to push the burden of being a monster onto him, and that's also why I believe that Yuta has a fundamental misunderstanding of Gojo's dream and ideology, which I'm saving for another video. Or at least I'm saving in another video to go much more in depth with, but that is mainly because of one statement that Yuta ends up making, which that statement is, if he dies, one of us will have to take that spot, and if no one else wants to step up, then I will. And that is where I believe that Yuta Okkotsu is fundamentally both going to make the same mistake that Gojo made, while also not being as strong as Gojo in this battle. He is going to believe that he himself is going to have to take on the burden of being a monster, but he believes that only one person can take on the monster role. He doesn't believe that it should be a shared burden among all of them. Sure, yes, he wants to take on Gojo's burden a bit, but he believes that the burden should ultimately fall onto one person because of the fact that he says if not one of you are willing to take up the role, then he will step up. He believes that only one person can be the monster, and because of that, I believe that it's more likely that Yuta is going to try and fight alone, that Yuta is going to try and take on the burden of being a monster alone in the same way that Gojo did, but that is ultimately going to cause him to fail. As there's something else I haven't even talked about in this video, which is the fact that even if Yuta does end up becoming Gojo, even if Yuta somehow manages to perfectly become Gojo and fight in the perfect way that Gojo does, that won't be enough, because of one other thing that needs to be accounted for that a lot of people aren't accounting for. Sukuna has already beaten Gojo. Whether you believe he needed 10 shadows to do it or not is irrelevant, because Sukuna has access to the tool to defeat Gojo once again. And some of you guys might be wondering, Sukuna doesn't have enough hands in order to make the proper hand sign, but you also need to remember, Sukuna can always just include more binding vows onto it, more binding vows onto himself to allow him to heal faster, or more binding vows onto the technique itself so he can perform it once again. Or something else that Sukuna might have access to. We have no idea yet, but all of this is ultimately to say that being Gojo is not going to be enough. Even if he can somehow manage to be Gojo, it will still fail because it's already been proven that Gojo is not enough. The only way that one can end up defeating Sukuna is by making Gojo's dream into a reality, making it so there are several strong allies that can fight alongside each other to put him down. And if Yuta ends up making the same exact mistake that Gojo does, he is going to end up cut in half once again, which, what can I say, it's a familiar experience for Yuta. So I will say, I do think there are possible ways that they can end up succeeding, but I don't think Yuta Okkotsu in Gojo's body can succeed alone, and that was ultimately the entire point of this video. If it's just going to be Yuta Okkotsu in Gojo's body, it will not work. It has to not be Yuta Okkotsu in Gojo's body alone. It has to be so much more than that in order to ultimately defeat Sukuna. However, that's my opinion on why I think they will ultimately fail if they end up going down this path, and I want to see what you guys think in the comment section down below. Do y'all think I'm right? Do y'all think I'm wrong? Whatever you all want to say, go in the comment section below, and I want to hear y'all think. Anyways, I'm gonna see y'all later. Peace out. Have a good day.